Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Harry Wilson. I am a cis white male in my late 30s. I've got light brown hair and a beard, and I'm wearing clear-rimmed glasses and a grey and white checked shirt. I'm a lecturer in digital theatre and performance making in the theatre department at the University of Bristol. And I'd just like to welcome everyone to our second TaBS talk of 2024. So TaBS is a series of online and in-person research seminars and practitioner talks hosted by the theatre department at the University of Bristol. The seminars are free and open to all, and a mixture of online webinars, in-person and hybrid talks streamed from the Wickham Theatre Building. If people are interested, keep an eye out for future events. On the 25th of April, we've got Dr. Rachel Han speaking online about her research into trans performance. And on the 22nd of May, Professor Royana Mitra and Dr. Swati Arora will be joining us in person in the Wickham Building for a conversation about their mutual experience as theatre and performance academics of South Asian heritage in the UK. Just a few online housekeeping notes. Katie will discuss, read for around 45 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions afterwards. As I said before, you're welcome to keep your camera on or off, depending on what feels comfortable for you. And as I mentioned, the talk will be recorded and will be made available. So if you don't want to be seen on the recording, then keep your camera off. We would ask that you keep your microphone on mute unless you're asking a question or speaking, to avoid any distracting noises. But as I said, there'll be opportunity for Q&A afterwards, and I'll invite you to unmute, or you can unmute yourselves to ask your question if you'd like. You're also welcome to use the chat to say hello, to tell us where you're joining from, to ask any questions. And I'll check this intermittently during the event, and we'll be able to kind of read out Q&A questions if people don't feel comfortable speaking on the Zoom. If you require closed captions or a live transcript, then we've enabled Zoom's auto-generated captions, which you can turn on in the toolbar below where it says CC closed captions, show captions, sorry. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Katie Gough from the University of Vermont, who'll be reading from and discussing her new book published by Methuen and Drama as part of the Thinking Through Theatre series. And the book's called Theatre and the Threshold of Death, Lectures on the Dying Arts. Katie is an associate professor of English and affiliated faculty in the Theatre and Dance program at the University of Vermont. She previously was a lecturer in theatre studies at the University of Glasgow. She's the author of Kinship and Performance in the Black and Green Atlantic, recipient of the 2014 Errol Hill Award from the American Society for Theatre Research. She also received the 2017 Oscar G. Brockett Essay Prize from ASTA and the Oscar G. Brockett Center for Theatre History and Criticism at the University of Texas, Austin, for her essay, The Art of the Loop, Analogy, Orality, History and Performance. And as I said, her most recent book, Theatre and the Threshold of Death, was published just in January this year. So I'm really delighted that Katie's joining us today from the US. Katie was my undergraduate dissertation supervisor, if you remember, Katie.
I remember.
And then I had the real pleasure of working alongside Katie at the University of Glasgow, where we taught together on the theatre studies course, which I've just realised was maybe over 10 years ago. Anyway, delighted that we're able to host Katie for our second TaBS talk, and I'm going to hand over to you, Katie.
Thanks so much, Harry, for the introduction. I'll just say again that I'm Katie Gough, and I am a cis white, middle-aged female with short blonde hair and blue eyes, and I'm wearing a navy cardigan and sort of multicolored scarf. thanks everyone for coming and joining from your various corners of the world today. I really appreciate it. And I'm really happy, Harry, that you invited me to talk about this. I feel like I'm following actually in your footsteps. Your book on Roland Barthes dramaturgy was published in this series a year before mine. So so congratulations to you for that. So I will start. I have a sort of long preface that will hopefully allow a way into engaging with the extracts of the book I'm gonna read for you. As you'll hear, it's kind of a I'd say a sort of curious book, a sort of strange book, but I'll let you be the judge. So, theater in the Threshold of Death for a long time was a project without form or genre. It was a question or series of questions around the mysterious appearance of 5 artists who were also considered mystics, who came into my life and seemed to insist that I follow them somewhere or remain curious about their practices. So as a preface to this preface, I sort of write about this series of artists more articulately in my book. So I'm going to read a couple pages to sort of set up the sort of talk to follow. So here it is, The Threshold of Death. My mystery unfolded over several years as a variety of artists, all of whom were also considered mystics, started calling out for my attention, continually gesturing for me to follow them into unknown territory. I did not have a past relationship with these women. They were not part of my research history. Nor did I find myself drawn to them in ways I could understand at the time. As my students might say, these women were not relatable to me. I first heard from the 12th century medieval mystic Hildegard of Bingen, considered the first musical composer, who was also a Benedictine nun, healer, visionary, and dramatist. This was followed by a call from the world-famous fin de siècle actress Eleanora Duse. Regarded as the first modern actor in the Western world, she was also hailed as a mystic in the theater and was a regular meditator. The mid-20th century philosopher, activist, and mystic Simone Weil, who Albert Camus called the only great spirit of our time, arrived by way of the Porziuncola in Assisi, where we both experienced a transformation of sorts. And at around the same time, I kept bumping into the work of the grandmother of performance art, Marina Abramovic, whose own practice of repeating patterns of behavior, followed by a career of listening in silence, called out to me in some nonlinear way. And finally, Swedish artist and medium Hilma of Klint, the first known and belatedly acknowledged abstract painter, arrived by way of a dream and took me to places I had not yet imagined. I had no idea what to do with this series of 5 singular figures, all of whom are a first in their discipline. For reasons that are unclear to me, not one of them would leave me alone. Despite my emphatic resistance, they demanded that I form some sort of relationship. Over time, I started thinking of them as a kind of faculty in an esoteric mystery school. They were certainly my teachers, but what was their teaching? After their biographical and autobiographical writing revealed little of the patterns to which I could relate, I started listening attentively for the lacuna in each of their life stories. I noticed where their stories break down, where their masks begin to slip, where they must let go of one world to make space for another, and where the thing that becomes interesting about them is the way they lose their discipline. These creative explorers went so deep into their own discipline that they broke something open, revealing that their disciplines were like window dressing behind which appeared a world more malleable, paradoxically less personal, and more relational. I was profoundly curious about this gap, so I kept hanging out in the lacuna of their stories to see what I might learn in this liminal space between the known and unknown worlds. Remarkably, it was in this space that I started to take on the characteristics of a protagonist in a mystery play, a play that was now producing my social reality, which is to say that once I discovered the pattern they shared, I started to lose my own discipline. In 2018-19, I was fortunate to take sabbatical from the Department of Theater at the University of Vermont. I decided that my sabbatical task would be to say yes to wherever my intuition told me to go as I embarked on my research into each woman in the series. As I traveled across large distances to find them, their lives crisscrossed backwards and forwards in time, and their stories braided their way into my own experience. Without quite knowing why or how, each time I crossed a threshold into their world, I was quite literally taken to practices, courses, seminars, workshops, and conferences that were simultaneously about dying and about healing. It was such a startling and often uncomfortable experience that all year I felt I was being led to my own death, but it was too late. I had already said yes. In the autumn term of my sabbatical, I went looking for Hildegard of Bingen at a cloistered Benedictine convent on the Vermont-Quebec border, and then met up with her again in a sound healing course held in a yurt in rural Vermont the following summer. My introduction to Eleanora Duse began several years ago on a 10-day silent meditation retreat before I was directed to her archive at the University of Glasgow, where I discovered her famous hands and the plaster casts made of them, which that's one of the casts of her hands on the front of the book. I picked up her trail again in 2018 as I followed her to an afterlife awareness conference in Orlando, Florida, of all places, before we were reunited in a course on healing touch run through the nursing program at UVM. Simone Weil appeared quite out of the blue, but when she did, her life was a revelation. My preoccupation with her death first led to my certification as an end-of-life doula through the Larner College of Medicine at UVM before training and working as a hospice volunteer in central Vermont. I got to know Marina Abramovic more intimately at the Live Art Development Agency in London while studying her relation works, 1976 to 88, before meeting up with her again at a family constellation workshop on transgenerational trauma and healing at the Omega Institute in New York later the same year. And finally, after Hilma of Klint found me in a dream, she sent me to the Arthur Findlay College of Psychic and Mediumship Studies on the outskirts of London before sending me to her retrospective at the Guggenheim Museum, where her largely unknown past was experiencing a different future in the aptly titled Hilma of Klint, Paintings for the Future. So that's a sort of to give a sense of the some of the materials and the strange kinds of journeys that these artists were taking me on. I'll say that almost all of the experiences, and there were many, happened in that sabbatical year, in that 2018-19. And despite the fact that it seemed like a bit of madness to do all of this training so quickly, something in me felt like it was urgent that things were completed in that year. And once the sabbatical was complete and I had what I thought was a draft of this book, I realized that nothing I had written was what I wanted to say. It no longer felt true to where the artist had taken me. So the book, as I had imagined it, died. And, much like the process of writing about death, I felt totally bereft for many months, not really knowing if it had all been for nothing. But then, of course, COVID happened. And the urgency of my training and the larger historical and cultural context for the book felt less personal, or if not less personal, maybe not only personal, but more relational and shareable. So, I mean, there's a lot I could say about the process of reimagining the book, but for the sake of time, I want to touch on 3 points that help form the scaffolding for the methods I use to produce the book in its current form. And then I want to read a couple of extracts from the book. So I'll begin. It's been an unusual process. I'm someone that this is much more of a critical creative process. Of course, the act of writing all books is creative, but my first book was it used theory a bit more heavily than the book that I've written, and certainly the methods were different. one of the questions that was a real mystery to start was what form it was going to take. How do I, how am I going to situate this material into a coherent story? And, maybe this is true for many of you, but one of the things, even in my academic writing, particularly for long projects like books, that I have found enormously influential and helpful is looking to novelists just to see the kinds of narrative structures they use in their book. So in my first book, Kinship and Performance in the Black and Green Atlantic, I was actually highly influenced by the form of David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, not the content, but it really helped me to think about what that book was like. And so in this book, I was really influenced by the American poet Ocean Vuong's autofictional novel On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Now the styles and the themes and the contents and the experiences in my book are nothing like his novel, but I was struck by a number of narrative conventions that are really powerful. The first being that it is written in the second person. It's written as a letter to his mother, who will never read it because she does not read or speak English. There's something very intimate in using the second person you, and the direct address is, of course, very theatrical in its way. But it's also interesting that that she literally will not be able to read it. So what form of intimacy is this if the person you are writing to both is and is not the recipient of your thoughts, dreams, reflections, ideas? When I got to rewriting the book, we were all in the middle of COVID. So as probably many of you did, I was often talking to myself. And for the first time in a long time, like the longest time I can remember, I was really without any real community. Even my students weren't there, cameras were turned off on screens, and it felt like I was speaking into a void. So I think that this also influenced this idea of wanting to speak as direct address, to address a you. And lecturing has always been my preferred mode of performance. So I thought it would be interesting to write a series of lectures for a course that doesn't exist, because the discipline does not exist, at least not in the way that the lectures are written. So it is written to students, but not necessarily to students I was or am teaching. Maybe I'm writing into the future. I still don't know. But not knowing is an integral part of what this book is trying to address. One peer reviewer for the book said that the experience of reading it is like following a carefully curated course of study, which is kind, and it I was happy to hear it, because that's the sort of intention as going from lecture to lecture, is it is a sort of course of study. If people are interested in the Q&A, I can talk more about this elastic quality of the second person you. You'll hear that that you is a bit of a shapeshifter in the but I'm going to save that for the Q&A. I will say as a side note, this feels significant too in terms of the context kind of producing certain kinds of methodologies for the book. But that while I was writing this book, the theater department where I worked started to fall apart. So all the tenured faculty members who were with me when I started in 2014 retired or quit during COVID. And in some real way, they were never replaced. So the theater does continue as a program, but not as an autonomous department at UVM. And I'm no longer a part of it. I now teach in the English department at UVM, with some affiliation with the theater and dance program. So, the dying arts was on my mind on several registers when I was writing. I had all the regular questions that many of us did during COVID, like what will become of theater? But also questions that were more existential. I am still teaching, and I can still teach in theater and performance studies to some extent. But I do feel like I lost my discipline in this moment. And so my questions were, what has theater and performance allowed me to think in my lifetime of studying and practicing and teaching in these fields? And, not for the first time, I realized that the tools of theater and performance, I use them to frame life experience, like especially those real but non-material or intangible experiences that feel mysterious. Like that's always been performance as a lens to understand these bigger questions has been an animating principle in my life. Which brings me to another formal convention that helped to organize these lectures, which are the dramaturgical principles of the medieval mystery play, especially the first mystery play. We'll remember the quem quaeratus trope. This trope, of course, appears in the middle of the Christian Mass and tells the story of the three Marys who visits Jesus's tomb, only to find that he is not there, that he's risen or he's alive in another way. But it's an interesting, it's dramaturgically interesting because it begins in catastrophe, like the death has already happened. And then there's a reversal of like, oh, what we thought death was is not maybe what it is. And then there's a recognition, which to me, because I'm not interested in the story in any religious context, but sort of a dramaturgical context, that there's a kind of change in consciousness. Things that we thought we knew for certain are no longer certain. So it reverses that Aristotelian dramaturgy that Anthony Kubiak writes about in Trope to Tragedy, where Aristotle figures it as recognition, reversal, catastrophe. Instead, this dramaturgy opens out so that there's an opening and out and an opening up. It's not necessarily clear what this change consciousness might mean or where it's taking us. And that seemed like an interesting kind of animating principle as I moved through what felt like a mysterious relational practice between me and the artists I was studying. The idea of returning to the rebirth of theater in the Middle Ages seemed interesting dramaturgically as a way of influencing the shape and tone of the lectures. And also because it's interesting that the rebirth of theater begins with a visit to a tomb, that it begins with a missing body who is alive in another way, but a way no less fleshy, felt important to the moment we are living in and through. So with these tools, hopefully I'm giving you a sense of it's been such a long gestation process, but these are some of the tools I use to think through the performance of these 8 lectures and how they sort of almost hang together dramaturgically. The book carries theory lightly, I think, but it animates the whole project, especially how to redirect ideas, terms, and concepts that are typically invoked to help explain or articulate stage practice. Instead, I use these same ideas and themes as a lens to explore life and death practices. In this way, performance is a lens for investigating less material forms of reality, like mystery, inner experience, non-material reality. Those parts that of life that we know is real, but that we cannot see, touch, taste in any tangible way. So this is a bit of a long preface, but I'm just going to add two more things. 2 concepts that animate this project, and that I can speak about more in the Q&A if anyone is interested, are the concepts of relationality and seriality. So this is written as a series of lectures, and probably unsurprisingly, the artists and thinkers that I explore in the book are fond of working in series. Mel Bachner in Art Forum has famously stated that seriality is a method and not a style. And so for me, seriality takes as its proposition that relationality is central to a way of knowing, that questions or concerns or curiosities are best investigated as part of a community of things, and that we must be attentive to what Donna Haraway calls relentless contingency. So in some ways, the lectures are offered up as a kind of teaching, but that they don't go in one direction. Like, I'm not trying to say, once this lecture is over, you're going to know this. So that feels important, that they're offered up, and how they resonate with a particular listener is part of this relentless contingency. So today, to give a little bit of a sample of how, like, you know, the artists that I'm writing about, the thinkers, maybe a couple ways that I'm thinking about death and dying in relation to theater, because it has so many different flavors depending on the person I'm thinking with and through. I'm going to read from lectures 3 and 4, which are largely focused on Eleanora Duse and Simone Weil. They're also the lectures, I'd say, that are most connected to the time that we're living in and through right now. I don't really think that post-COVID even makes sense, because my students are out with COVID every week. So that hasn't ended. I use the concepts of gesture and alienation in these lectures in really unorthodox ways. So I guess one more thing to set this up is that each lecture builds on the one that came before it. So in the lecture before the one I'm about to read, it's a lecture on genre, and it's largely exploring the genre of mystery. And I use as a referent several iterations of a painting, a sort of famous theme in painting, on the theme of noli me tangere, which means do not touch, or stop clinging to me, or you must let go of me. This is allegedly what Jesus tells Mary Magdalene when he appears to her after his death in the form of a gardener. And I'm not so much interested in it as a religious theme, but in the formal ways the scenes are painted as a mystery. And the question of what it is to have experiential knowledge of something or someone that you cannot grasp or hold on to. This image and theme comes up in the lecture on Duse, so I wanted to gloss it. The other thing I want to gloss that runs through almost like as a motif or a red herring, that is a device that I follow through, is that the human hand, sort of connects one lecture to another. So at the end of the second lecture here, I'm talking about gesture, and that begins the third lecture. So I'm going to read maybe the last paragraph of that second lecture before I head into gesture, so that you can see the connections. So here's the last paragraph of genre. You remain haunted by Mary's outstretched hands, her longing to connect with this figure who is all that her heart desires, to place her hand in his. The mixed reality of the moment does not allow her to fully feel that her sentient hands will never reach him. This gesture of two hands folding into one, a gesture so fully human that it is almost unremarkable, except for the clarity of Mary's desire that Christ can only validate by way of a visual refusal, is a gesture, Heidegger tells us, that is meant to carry us all into the great oneness. And then lecture 3, gesture. And I'm not going to read the full lectures. I'm just going to read extracts from 3 and 4. Ask any young acting student about the difficulties of their craft, and they will inevitably say that the question of what to do with their hands is a perennial problem. You tell me that your own students discuss this with you, but the challenge precedes them by decades, if not centuries. Konstantin Stanislavski, 1863 to 1938, the famous Russian director and acting teacher, writes about how his own students devalue the hands in his An Actor Prepares. Written in the form of a diary of a fictional acting student in his first year of training in Stanislavski's system of acting, the teacher returns again and again to the relationship between the hands and the imagination. Tortsov, The name of the fictional acting teacher tries to convey the importance of small gestures by recalling for his students how Lady Macbeth, at the culminating point in her tragedy, is preoccupied with washing a spot of blood on her hand. A student in his class thinks it's ridiculous to suggest that Shakespeare wrote this tragedy to focus our attention on the simple gesture of Lady Macbeth washing her hands. You forgive the student's inability to put aside the grandeur for the reality of such a quotidian act. Or as Tortsov lectures his student, in real life, many great moments of emotions are signaled by some ordinary, small, natural movement. The student is young and knows little about mortality, which is what Tortsov tries to convey as he turns from a discussion of this Shakespearean scene to the scene of an imagined loved one who is dying. He asks the student to consider the activities in which a friend or a relative of a loved one might keep themselves occupied while their beloved is dying. Preserving quiet in the room, he suggests, or carrying out the doctor's orders, taking the temperature, applying compression, he continues. You're surprised that he yokes these two experiences together. You never notice the ways that your own associations with how hands bring theater and death into conversation are tacitly linked by Stanislavski. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And you can't unsee its relationship to that medieval painting you keep going on about. Tortsov, for his part, has the student's hands bandaged when he begins to using them too freely in his acting scene. When asked why he does this, Tortsov replies, I want you to be convinced that whereas the eyes are the mirror to the soul, the tips of the fingers are the eyes of the body. You recall the scene of Mary reaching out her hands and Jesus's resistance to touch, and you think it is possible that Jesus might be Mary's first acting teacher. There's something about the way he tells her, you don't need your hands for this. Reality in the way you understand it is not part of this scene right now. We're here together resting in an internal garden that doesn't require your hands to act. Mary, he might have continued, let's think about this moment. What we've got here is a failure of the imagination to render real that which we cannot touch. If you can't do that, how do you expect others to believe? You yourself have spent most of your adult lifetime trying to convey the reality of the imaginal world to students who are told repeatedly that after they leave this training ground, they will have to forgo these questions to enter the real world. But if the real world isn't where you are, where have you been your whole life? Reality is a sticking point for you, or is at least sticky, so you can't dismiss the issue. What is the real world? You suspect that, like Mary finally understands, most of what is real in the world you can't actually touch. You also suspect that you learned this from Eleanora Duse, 1858 to 1924, an Italian tragedian and the first modern actor in the Western world. You were certain that she would agree about Jesus being Mary's first acting teacher. If anyone understands how theater takes us into the mystery, it is Duse. She understands the grandeur of a small, silent gesture. In your office, sometime later, you show me newspaper clippings that you find in the Eleanora Duse archive, a glimpse at the source of what is now largely understood as the basis of Stanislavski's entire system of actor training. And I have many newspaper clips here of people describing her hands. So I'll read three of them to you. So this is from 1893, the New York Herald. Madame Duse's most wonderful possessions are her arms and hands, with which she points her speeches in a way which defies all. But her hands never seem to lose their tension or become tender and caressing. They grasp when they might touch and clutch instead of hold. Another one from the Manchester Guardian in 1923. There was the old exquisite play of hands, that constant fumbling and gathering of her dress, which as in a statue, it becomes part of the body's interpretation, as with Duse, the body becomes the soul. And then another from a review of her place in D'Annunzio's The Dead City, and watch her beautiful hands as they flutter about in minor gestures and sweep the air when power and strength are required. They are a poem. So exquisite are they in themselves and so purposeful in their youth. And it just goes on and on, just this obsession. with acting with her hands. So included in these notes is a photograph of a plaster cast of Eleanora Duse's right hand. The photograph of Duse's plaster hand haunts you. You find reference to it in several museum collections. There's evidence of a prolific number of her hands circulating the Atlantic world. The plaster hands remind you of medieval relics in the age of mechanical reproduction. What is it that medieval people are after when they decide to take bits of a saint's body, bits of their clothes or hair or fingernails, or maybe even a whole finger or a hand? And what are they after when they worship religious icons, which some scholars suggest are understood as having a life force? Is it the same thing that Duse's fans are after as they look for ways of worshiping their icon, an icon made present in the material form of a plaster cast of her hand? And what are you doing in her archive about 100 years later, taking digital pictures of a photograph that could itself be a copy of a photograph of a plaster cast that is a copy of a hand, but not the copy? It is a copy of a copy of a copy. And is the photograph that you find in the archive waiting for you to take that digital picture? Does this iconic image have a life force of its own? Is this Duse-drenched icon in the age of mechanical reproduction waiting for a future audience member to put time back in the image, to keep it in motion? You tell me that all of these questions are really a way of asking, what does it mean for an image to survive its own death? Or what does it mean for an image to have an afterlife? Is it possible, you wonder, for a gesture to be frozen in an image, left there for hundreds of years and quite without precedent, be activated in another medium through a living gestures of a different kind of mystic who also has the power to see with her ears, a power made visible in the image of her hands? Whether it is Mary's hands or Duse's hands, both are longing for a glimpse of reality, what Duse calls in a letter to her daughter Enrichetta as, quote, life itself, and it is outside of life, unquote. In some inexplicable and undeniable way, you reanimate the gesture from her archive, connect with the energy of the quest through your own kind of performance. Duse's hand is not the reality, but it points you in the right direction. You tell me that you feel like Mary, trying to reach Duse on the other side of the rift through a desire to make contact with her now plaster hands. You say that she leaves them circulating the world so that someone might take them and be carried away from the stage, might disappear into that other reality for which the stage is a mere veil. Even you cannot imagine where she sends you once she realizes that you are serious about seeking out reality, that you want to find this life outside of life. Though you were slightly tentative about admitting this, you tell me that not too long ago, you seek the support of a career counselor because you yourself no longer feel you are in the right story. You feel you're being called to a different kind of life. Still feel this, but you lack the imagination to bring this life into reality or even imagine what world might want to be built. The career counselor suggests that you bring in a series of action steps to help you investigate different options. Like Aristotle, she seems to know that action comes before character. It is completely ludicrous that one of the main action steps on your list, the one you're most excited to enact, is to attend a conference in Florida you discover on the internet the previous day, the Afterlife Awareness Conference. In this space, the space of a hotel in this instance, hospice doctors, nurses, energy workers, shamans, mystics, and mediums gather and give lectures on the different ways that they research, explore, and experience something called the afterlife. Months later, you attend the conference despite your anxiety about what this decision says about your character. You tell me that you attend countless theater conferences over the years where people talk on some pale approximation of the imaginal world, but this is the first conference you attend where the speakers actually believe the imaginal world is real. If you're honest, it feels like a relief. This tension between your career in the theater and where the medium of theater leads you has Duse's fingerprints all over it. You know this first when you sign up for an introductory workshop on mediumship. The teacher takes you through a series of exercises that are helpful for sharpening intuition. The exercises would be familiar to you from an improvisation class, or the object is similar anyway, to bypass the rational mind so that you can begin to work in alignment with instinct. There is certainly not an exercise that you practice that is unfamiliar to artists attempting to access creative dimensions. Not for the first time you understand that Duse is a medium between two worlds, but this still does not explain how her hands got you there. While there are more shamans, mediums, and mystics gathered inside the hotel than is prudent, these are not the people you find the most curious. Instead, you keep bumping into and befriending hospice nurses and women who call themselves end-of-life doulas. You hear about these doulas just before attending the conference and then continue to read everything you can find. But this too is curious. You were surprised that you have such an appetite for death and dying, and an even greater appetite for this thing called afterlife. You wonder if this is why Duse dies over and over on the stage, why she is best known for tragedy. Is it because she too has an appetite for death and dying? You tell me that you've pieced together some notes on Duse to find a way into the mystery you both share. And so this is a section called The Age of Duse, Notes for a Performative Lecture. I go on a 10-day silent meditation retreat. I return. A friend asked me what it was like. I say if I was an actress, it would be a great way to prepare for a part. He asks why. I say when you meditate for that long, parts of you disappear. There's less you to get in the way, more space for something else to come in. But that's just a guess. I'm not an actor. He asks, have you read The Mystic in the Theater? I say no, and then I read it. It's about the life of Eleanora Duse. She meditated. I also learned that Duse and I are interested in the same medieval mystics. In the archive, I become obsessed with her hands. It's not hard to see why. Everyone was obsessed with them, but critics and audiences had actually seen them, or were transported by them, or healed by them, or felt heard by them. What was it exactly? And now I'm wearing an archivist's white gloves and taking digital pictures of a photograph of a plaster cast of Eleanora Duse's right hand. She was an Italian tragedian. She was the first modern actor in the Western world. She played the transitions, acted between the words, most often the words of terribly written plays. She was not afraid of silence. She was said to shapeshift before audiences. By all accounts, she was a shaman. Duse's superpower was her ability to disappear, leaving only her plaster hands as evidence that she was a material presence in the world. Disappearance, reproduction. She knew the theatrical drill. She leaves the stage in 1909. To save the theater must be destroyed, she says in 1912. In May 1915, Italy enters World War I. Duse refuses to entertain the troops on the front lines. She goes instead to sit with the soldiers, writing letters for them, holding their hands, delivering packages, listening. She stays in a hotel close to the warfare during one visit. When she returns, her hotel is a pile of rubble, bombed. Her timing was always impeccable. Letter dated December 15th, 1915, to Enrichetta, her daughter in England, whom we now have evidence was a British spy. She says, I have done everything in life between one departure and another. The heart has remained motionless, turned toward that suffering, that light, that thing that is everything and that is nothing. This is what I'm after, I think, as I follow her hands. Evidence of where theater is really taking us, has always taken us. Duse studies the new cinema, or silent medium, her term. Quote, all is seen, experienced, documents, evidence in hand, a news item, the exterior of a poor life displayed by machine every evening the same way. Nothing of what is not seen and weaves a life, unquote. The first moving images on cinema screens during World War I display a terrifying number of corpses, sentient and celluloid. What to do with all of those missing bodies? To Enrichetta, June 1916, the realization of film is a spiritual problem. Medieval art is the answer to her spiritual problem. Another language, perhaps, for connecting with missing bodies. 1916, Duse films Cinere, or Ashes. She treats filmic images like tableau vivant, living pictures. Duccio's Descent from the Cross and Giotto's Lamentations find their way into the film. We teach students that theater is reborn in the churches of medieval Europe. For all we know, it is reborn 1,000 times in 1,000 places during those pesky dark ages. This time, though, Theater is reborn through a popular musical number about a missing body. Whom do you seek? The angel sings to the Marys. Where is Jesus? They sing back. He's where he said he would be. Not here, but not here, the angel belts out before telling them to spread the good news. Disappearance, reappearance. Disappearance, reappearance. This death does history like theater. Duse patiently wrings the very life out of the dusty tragedy she performs to play with a death like this. When she does, her audiences follow her hands all the way to oblivion. Life is not cinema, she writes to Giorgio Papini. Neither is death. In 1918, Duse tests positive for the Spanish flu. Federico Garcia Lorca later writes of her Duende, play and death, her forte. She survives and returns to her plays in 1922. She needs the money. The theater had not died, but it most definitely kills her. April 1924, outside in the rain, unable to get in through the locked stage door, drenched, first influenza, then pneumonia. She dies at age 65 in Pittsburgh. She is performing Marco Praga's The Closed Door, play and death. To Enrichetta, 1917, you who live in a high intellectual environment, do not believe that your mother follows the church or chooses the Middle Ages just because I have chosen something from the 13th century. Not at all. On the contrary, it is very modern, as everything recurs. Wars, illnesses, beauty and ugliness, greatness, and the stupidity of the world. So I'm going to, and that's what I'll end for the gesture lecture, and then I will just move on to just read the first part of the next lecture, alienation. And this one is about me discovering and then sort of discovering Simone Weil and where that discovery took me. So lecture 4, and lecture 4 is about halfway through the book. There will come a time in any meaningful play when you are asked to reflect upon the question, what changes? Everything always changes. So this needs to be a rather striking change. It is usually in the middle of the story, but can really be anywhere the dramatist places it. Wherever it is placed, it asks you to find an essential moment that you must pass through that will take you from the beginning to the end of the play. Since the original mystery play begins in catastrophe before moving to a reversal of what you know to be true and ending in recognition, you are guessing that the change in your own real-life mystery play is also a recognition of what you know to be true about yourself, maybe also about the world. You're mopping your floor one afternoon and listening to an audiobook of Thomas More's A Religion of One's Own, when he starts discussing an unaligned, agnostic, Jewish, French Marxist mystic named Simone Weil, 1909 to 1943. She is convalescing in Assisi after an accident in Spain where she goes to fight the fascists, an accident which involves her spilling hot oil, and it is blamed on her notoriously clumsy hands. Anyway, she's in Assisi and visits La Porziuncola, St. Francis's first church, says Moore. She is standing there in that little 12th century Romanesque chapel when all of a sudden she says that something stronger than she is compels her for the first time in her life to go down on her knees. She's overwhelmed. It is remarkable because at the very moment you hear about her mystical experience, you are looking at a painted tile of the Annunciation you purchased in Assisi, a replica of the one you saw in La Porziuncola years ago because the visit also changed your life, although you didn't fall down on your knees. There's also the interesting coincidence that in the Eleanora Duse archive, you come across a photograph of Duse's home in Oslo, Italy, that she names La Porziuncola after her pilgrimage to Assisi in 1895. You digress. In your own mystical madness, it is still not clear what side of the hyphen you occupy. You take Simone Weil's experience in La Porziuncola as a sign. You go to the library and find everything Simone Weil writes and everything that is written about her. You do a good job. You open the first book and see that she writes about Pythagoras. In fact, this essay you read answers all the weird questions you ever have about why Pythagoras thinks God and number are the same thing. Quote, there is never anything in human thought but relationships, writes Weil in the Pythagorean doctrine. And she goes on. This identity is what St. John expresses in giving to Christ the name of the relation, logos, and what the Pythagoreans express in saying, all is number. When we know that we live in divine mediation, not as a fish in the sea, but as a drop of water in the sea. In us, outside of us, here below, in the kingdom of God, nowhere is there any other thing, and mediation is exactly the same thing as love. And then you read what she writes about Antigone in Greek tragedy. And then you read what she writes about attention and affliction. And then you read what everyone has to say about her eating disorder. And then you read everything you can find about the strange circumstances that lead to her dying alone in a tuberculosis sanatorium in Kent, England in 1943. And then you try to bring more people into your story with her, ancestors, friends, strangers, historical figures. You try to bring everything into relation. You want to keep it focused on all of the things you have in common, all of the things that bring you into relationship. Maybe you think this will help her to recognize you. But at some point, you get preoccupied with her death, maybe even a little obsessed with her death. Her death feels like a part of your own story, but you can't say why. You start to sketch out some notes for a lecture. And so this is the final performative lecture notes that I'll read. Simone Weil's relationships, lecture notes. It is her death that gets me. Everyone has something to say about it. Nothing positive, pretty despicable, really. Self-starvation, willful brat, crazy lady, pious martyr. Yeah, sure, I can see it. It makes me angry. But so does she, showing up unexpectedly and forcing me to think about her death, and death in general. A therapist friend who had never heard of her diagnoses her on the spot when I attempt to explain. Anorexia. Simone Weil, 1909 to 1943. Mystic, activist, scholar, pacifist, and patron saint of anomalous persons, dies of tuberculosis at Grosvenor Sanitarium in Kent, England, on October 24th, 1943. 5 months after penicillin is available to the general public, but not for her. Margaret Gough, 1864 to 1943, my great-grandmother, dies of tuberculosis 3 months before Simone. Also no penicillin. There's a war going on. Unaligned mystic, says Thomas More. A saint, says T.S. Eliot. The only great spirit of our time, says Albert Camus. Cardiac failure due to starvation and pulmonary tuberculosis. The disease did kill and slay herself by refusing to eat whilst the balance of her mind was disturbed, says Weil's death certificate. I hope one person is with her when she dies who is not an asshole. Given the death certificate, it is not her doctor. Tuesday Express, headline, 1943, French professor starves herself to death. Kent Messenger, headline, 1943, death from starvation, French professor's curious sacrifice. And you know, tuberculosis, that old chestnut. Did you know that there were 1.5 million deaths from tuberculosis in 2018, the leading cause of death worldwide? Airborne disease, respiratory illness, a global threat. She dies with no family within 3,000 miles. They are finally safe in New York. She alone ventures back across the Atlantic to London with some vague hope of being sent to France to fight in the resistance. A death sentence for a Jewish woman. She is, of course, never sent. Born in Paris to agnostic Jewish parents, by her teens she masters 2 dead languages and several living ones. The only uncontested fact about her personality, she's brilliant. She quits teaching the classics in 1934 to labor in factories around Paris. It's funny, really, how unsuited she is for the work. But it teaches her a lot about affliction, which she says is the uprooting of a life, a more or less attenuated equivalent of death, made irresistibly present to the soul by the attack or immediate apprehension of physical pain. 2 years later, she publishes Antigone in Between Ourselves, a little factory magazine. It's for the masses, she says. Her article focuses on Uncle King Creon sentencing Antigone to a living death. He walls her up in a cave to die unseen because she gives her brother, deemed an enemy of the state, a proper burial. The obligation of public mourning, Antigone insists. The right of the state to refuse to acknowledge the dead, Creon demands. This dead language knows something about the affliction of the powerless and the politics of death. And speaking of dead languages, I'm amazed when Weil explains why Pythagoras thinks God and number are the same things. All that is known involves number, for without number, nothing can be thought or known. Replace number with God and read again. Pythagorean geometry is all about the connection between the seen and unseen world. She loves the way it brings unlike things into relationship. But I'm still not sure I understand her, because Weil's own mystical logic always swings back and forth, a kind of portal between degrees of consciousness, part science and part something else. The part something else starts to take hold and reminds me that I'm still frustrated by my friend, her quick diagnosis, anorexia, plucking out the heart of Weil's mystery. I wake up the morning after we talk, and a name whispers itself in my ear. Catherine of Siena. Later I read, mystic, activist, scholar, doctor of the church, patron saint of nurses. Even later I read, Catherine of Siena, 1347 to 1380, is born in the year of the plague or Black Death. Estimates show the world's population decreases from 450 million to about 350 million after the plague of 1347. Also, no penicillin. It recurs 3 times in Catherine's life. She is only 1 year younger than Simone's 34 years when she dies. Like Simone, she dies in the midst of war and pandemic, and she dies of self-starvation, unable to eat. Rudolph M. Bell writes in Holy Anorexia, in the end, she has committed the sin of vainglory and had starved herself to death. It had been her will and not his that had triumphed all these years and now lay vanquished. A judgy death certificate written over 500 years after her death, little better than Simone's own. And then there is Susan Sontag, bowing before Weil's mystery. No one who loves life would wish to imitate her dedication to martyrdom, nor would wish it for his children, nor for anyone else whom he loves. Yet so far as we love seriousness as well as life, we are moved by it, nourished by it. In the respect that we pay to such lives, we acknowledge the presence of mystery in the world, and mystery is just what the secure possession of truth, an objective truth, denies. Every being cries out silently to be read differently, cries Weil silently in one of her notebooks. She also says, the poet produces the beautiful by fixing his attention on something real. It is the same with the act of love. To know that this man who is hungry and thirsty really exists as much as I do, that is enough. The rest follows of itself. Catherine knows this love. Hunger is complicated. By all accounts, Catherine is a healer and miracle worker. We are told that her voice, lovely both in speech and song, soothed dying beds. Her touch and prayers healed the sick. Whether she cures all the sick cannot really be verified. She helps to heal the dying, though, holds space for the dying, renders them visible to themselves. Maybe some face their own death without fear. Did anyone do this for Simone Weil, I wonder? Maybe that's the point of everything. May 2019, I finished the end-of-life doula training course. November 2019, I complete training as a hospice volunteer. March 2020, I sit with a dying patient in a nursing home. A state of emergency is called 3 days later. Airborne disease, respiratory threat, a respiratory illness, a global threat, everything now in relationship. And I'll end there, the reading.
Thank you so much, Katie.
Thanks.
It's really great to be immersed in the kind of world of the book, I guess, and your process and methods of developing it. We have some time for questions. I would encourage people to put questions in the chat if they'd like to, or to raise their hand, and you can ask a question in person. I'll let people have a little think by doing a sort of chair's privilege of asking the first question. And I suppose I'm interested, you said at the beginning, Katie, that the book, the first draft of the book was not the book that you wanted to write, or I can't remember exactly how you phrased it. Not the book that kind of represented the journey that you've been on, I suppose. Is me paraphrasing. So what was that first draft? And how did you get from there? I mean, you don't have to reveal that if you don't want to, but how did you get from there to the published book? And I can imagine there were some creative challenges along the way and some problems to solve, but also maybe some. Did you encounter any kind of barriers in terms of kind of publishing and things like that, that made you where you had to kind of fight for the form in a way, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, no, those are great. Those are great questions. And it's I'm trying to think back about like how I would describe the first iteration. Is that, in some ways I was sort of writing my way into a kind of comprehension of what was happening. And so in doing so, while this book is in some ways, obviously I'm in it, like you can hear me in it, but the first iteration I feel like was much more autobiographical in ways that felt a little bit less relational. Like, you know what I mean? Like I'm like, I don't know if these are well-rehearsed stories that I didn't think of at the time as well-rehearsed stories that I'm telling myself about myself. And in some ways they don't feel true to the experience of being led by, in this, almost, I sort of feel like even the practice of this book was probably influenced by my time teaching in the UK, where practice is research sort of methods are much more prevalent than they are in the US, and certainly were back when I was writing it. So that sense of being taken into something that where I was surprising myself, but also where I was deeply uncomfortable because this isn't the me I thought I knew. And so how being in relationship with experiences or people that make us uncomfortable can build different worlds, and so I wanted to sort of speak to that. So it felt so the first iteration, and it just felt untrue on some way, like I was like, I finished this year and I did all these things and look, I got a draft. And then as I read it, it started to fall apart. And I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that I didn't even want to get out of bed when I realized it had fallen apart, like for months. Like I'm just like, I can't believe this died on me. Like, God damn it, I'm writing about death and it just died on me. And at the same time, a really important person in my life, at the end of 2019 when this was happening, she also died quite quickly and unexpectedly, and she lived in Glasgow. And so I couldn't get back to her funeral or anything. So I was having the experience in advance of COVID that many people then had. Like, you can't mourn deaths and all of those things. So it went into hiatus for a while, but once COVID happened and grief and death were in the world, like there was a certain kind of strange power of being like, wow, what is this about? This feels a lot less personal. But kind of like all of us, I had the attention span of a goldfish, for a good part of of early COVID. And so what I decided to do is just take each of the artists that I write about and just write 1,000 words about each one. And that was it, like just as a way of trying to get back. And those actually form the foundation for the performative lecture, like the lecture notes that take place within the chapters. And so it started from there. And then then from there was another voice that came in, and I think it was probably was to be in isolation that begins the first lecture, that asks a question. Remember when we were in class and you started talking about Aristotle's Poetics? And so from there, it sort of was like, oh, this is going to be lectures. Like, I'm going to be able to talk to people. I don't know if that answered all your questions. May have had another one in there.
I think there was just one about publishing, and I mean, you definitely answered the first part of it, but just, yeah, whether there were any barriers that made it tricky to get it out.
I mean, a lot. The barriers were mostly that, I'm writing, I mean, it's a funny barrier, like it's ironic in a way. Like, so I'm writing about liminality and thresholds and the in-between places. And what was attractive to me about all of these women I write about, not only that they have these profound experiences in middle age. So that was like just quite interesting to me, because I'm writing about the Middle Ages and I'm in middle age and I'm thinking about these women. But that they are always in between these thresholds. And so the book is, to me, I'm like, it's not really for a popular press, but I don't really know if it's for an academic press. And so it really was sort of straddling creative nonfiction and something academic, something that I didn't want to be so laden with theory that couldn't be picked up by people that didn't know, so like it was trying to do a lot of different things and move in those worlds. And just on a whim, I'm like, well, this is a thinking through with theater. And so I'm just going to reach out to Joe Kelleher and say, would you read a draft? If you think it's nonsense, just tell me. but if you think I should submit a proposal, let me know. And so it sort of came from those experiences of him sharing it with other editors and them saying, no, this totally would work for this series. But it was, it doesn't seem like there was like, unlike the first book that was more academic, where there was like, oh, there could be multiple people that I could send this to. This one felt like, that even, throughout the process, having to sort of frame and articulate to peer reviewers or responding to them. It was a tricky publishing feat.
Yeah, yes, like that thing of how do you justify a book about losing your own discipline, like in a kind of marketplace that's completely disciplinary. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Thank you, Katie. I'll open it out so I don't hog the conversation too much. We've got one question in the chat, but if anyone has one, just raise your hand. Maybe we'll take Simon and then I'll come back to Julia's question in the chat. I don't see anyone else at the moment.
Thank you, Katie, very much. Thank you, Harry. I could have gone on listening to you for a long, long time. I think one of the things that I wanted to raise follows on from the kind of register of Harry's points. I'm curious how you chose the 5 artist mystics, whether that shortlist was self-evident, there they were, or did you have a kind of longer selection of people? Did they choose you in a way? And by the end, this is slightly sort of irreverent question. Did any of them disappoint you? Did any of them not do the job of work which the sort of project, not the one you abandoned, but the project which we have in front of us, which you're talking about, did they not quite service what you were hoping to do?
Yeah. Thanks, Simon. Let me see the first part of that question. I really feel like now, and this wasn't all like they appeared in 2018-19. So I think like Hildegard of Bingen had been sort of someone that had been animating my thinking since the time I was in Glasgow. So probably starting in like 2012. And so she was sort of the first person, but I did have some sort of strange experiences with finding out about them, and then so that I feel like the choosing me part seems right. I mean, I did find out, I knew very little, actually, maybe embarrassingly, but very little about Eleanora Duse until I was just, offhandedly describing to the old chair of my department about this meditation retreat I had been on. And he said, "Have you ever read The Mystic in the Theater?" And from what was strange about that is then thinking, I wonder where her, if I could ever get to a collection of English language archives. And then bizarrely finding out that they were at the University of Glasgow, where I had just left. So I mean, there were just some strange coincidences there. And similarly with Simone Weil, as I sort of articulate in this, I of course knew who Simone Weil was, but I didn't really know much about her. And then got very interested in her for odd reasons, like, oh, I remember having a strange experience in that chapel in Assisi. It's like all these strange things that that made me want to continue. And that went on for each of them. And that they are so singular. I mean, I think that even in my first book, I'm very interested in singular figures. I don't know what that says about me, but I'm very interested in that. And the fact that they were sort of leaders in their disciplines and did something else. I can't say that any of them disappointed me. I think that the figure that I wrestled with the most and that I was frustrated with the most, and it sort of seems like this was her temperament in life. So maybe it was Simone Weil. I think that she asked the most of me in terms of like, there's other artists that I talk about in the book that lead me to think about death differently. So with Marina Abramovic, there's a kind of like the turn towards death is a turn towards transgenerational healing, is sort of like what lives on. With Hilma of Klint, because she was a medium, it had that kind of almost playfulness attached. But Simone Weil really took me to finitude, to like, this is our one life. And how do we deal with death and dying? And so that I found her, I got really angry with her a lot. And what it forced me to confront in myself. So I think that might answer your question.
Thank you. Wow.
Thanks, Simon.
I think Julia's question leads on nicely from there. She's asked, I'm curious, once the book was finished, did you find the mystics left you alone, or are they still kicking around?
That's a really good question. For a while, I feel like this project is, it came out just in January, but as we all know with books, the long gestation process before they ever reach the world. And so I do feel like afterwards, there was some of that. I don't know if part of me has just not kept myself open to those artists and thinkers. I mean, one way that they continue to animate my thinking, and maybe it's interesting, actually, that question, now that I think about it, because not as individuals, it's not like they're still around, but one of the courses that I designed sort of after this book that they don't appear in, but they are animating the whole thing, is an interdisciplinary arts course that I'm now teaching in 2 contexts, in the English department and the Honors College, called Healing Ancestral Ghosts. And so that very much, I think, is a part of thinking through certain kinds of relationship to, what dies and what remains. Yeah.
I'd love to do that course. Do we have any more questions from anyone? Either you can ask yourselves or pop them in the chat. Otherwise, I will ask one, which I've been dying to ask, but anyone? Any more for any more? I'm interested in the use of you, the second person, Katie. And I suppose I can't remember whether you said it was. I don't think you said fluid, but you said something kind of that it's a kind of it's non-specified who the you is really, I guess.
Yeah.
But maybe I would get more of a sense of that if I read more of the book. But you know, you're addressing the reader, but you're also addressing the kind of attendees of the lectures. But then it's kind of also you as well, I think, because it's your journey. So you don't have to. It may be all of those things and more, but and you don't have to say, you know, you don't have to sort of decide. But do you want to say any more about that choice? I think you mentioned at the beginning that we could discuss it more, and
Yes.
how it
Yeah.
shifted from I to you, I guess.
Yeah.
I
was looking through the intro because as I was writing, someone alerted me to a book that had just came out by a medieval scholar and critic, Barbara Newman, who had written a book called The Permeable Self: 5 Medieval Relationships. And since, that sort of medieval dramaturgy sort of weaves its way through these lectures, I'll just read this because it sort of helps to describe the you. But she describes the concept of personhood in the medieval world as one that is counter to our understanding of an individual and their solitude. Personhood was always interpersonal, illuminating relations at a certain pitch of intensity where the boundaries between persons seem to blur. Crucially, the permeable self appears most often at the liminal junctures and imagined endpoints of personal history. The essence of personhood, writes Newman, is the capacity to be permeated by other selves and other persons without being fractured by them. In this sense, a person has little to do with either the self-sufficient, much maligned Enlightenment self or the decentered, fragmented, postmodern self. Rather, the person is, by definition, the interpersonal. One cannot be a person by oneself, but only with, through, and in other persons. And so that seemed to me I'm like, wow, that's so resonant. That gives sort of language to this sense of the you that is sometimes, I feel like you said, me talking to myself, or having a conversation with another aspect of myself, but sometimes is directly in relationship to an imagined audience. And at other times I sort of feel like the you is actually the artist I'm thinking with. And so there's a kind of porosity there that feels like an interesting kind of way of thinking about relationality, if that makes sense.
It would be fun to do one of these lectures as in a course and see how that you is received, I guess, because I was thinking it through in terms of how we usually address a group of students, say, in a room, and how we might guide them through an understanding of something. But what we don't often do is put them in the position of the thing we're describing, or or walk them through an experience, say it's a performance or whatever, as if they are the audience member in that moment.
Yeah.
I mean, we're looking with some of our students at the moment at interactive stories, so we've been doing a lot of second person.
Oh,
So
cool.
it's on my like interactive fiction. So yeah, so it's interesting, I think. Thanks for that answer. I think it's a really interesting approach.
Thanks.
Do we have any, Simon again? Is there anyone that would like to ask something that hasn't had a chance to yet? And otherwise we'll hear from Simon again.
I'm very happy not to be again. I don't want to.
Well, we have time for another question. So we'll just see if anyone else would like to, and if not, you're free to, Simon. Okay, go for it. Why don't you go for it?
Okay. Katie, I hadn't realised that in the course of the last few years that your theatre studies department has imploded and you are now working in English and so on. I'm wondering how much, even, I mean, so there was a sort of infrastructural thing going on as you were writing this, if I understand the chronology correctly. Even if that had not been the case, has this whole project taken you possibly further away from the territory of theatre in a way that surprised you, or you were heading anyway? And I'm just thinking of two books I've been involved in recently, and without there being the intention behind it, the Ruins book and another cultural policy book about mime and physical theatre, both have taken me out of the landscape that I habitually have inhabited. And I just wondered, because these five figures, two are theatre, well, Marina Abramovic, artist, performer, Duse, actress, and so on, but they're not theatre figures as such. Sorry, that's all a bit convoluted, but I'm interested in your journey in relation to theatre studies.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question. I think it's one I still grapple with a little bit. I mean, so what's what's interesting, and I don't know if it'll be interesting for other people in this conversation, but I'll just sort of describe some of the differences even between the program that I was in when I was with you, Simon and Harry, at Glasgow, and the theater department at UVM, where I think, in UK terms, it might appear more like a conservatoire program, so there were MFAs and I was like the only PhD in the program. So it was largely based on practice. So what I'll say is that the move to English, it has, and because there's a lot of cultural media studies people in the English department, so like the move to the English department has in some ways felt more comfortable. But in other ways, because the theater department always felt like not where I had started off with as a performance studies PhD, or just the way that theater was organized felt very different than it was in Glasgow, where I felt very comfortable with those models. So I both grieve the loss of it, and at the same time I'm like, oh, that's a curious grief, because I'm able to sort of like redirect theater and performance into these other areas and teach other kinds of students within this program that might feel a little bit more aligned with maybe who I am now. But I'm still sort of working out the kinks of that, because it's a bit of another kind of, and I don't think that, as the future goes on, I don't know how many postgraduates in the room, but I don't think that this is going to be an unusual experience for people. But in the theater department at UVM, I had lovely colleagues, but I felt like the only one, teaching all of the academic courses. And then I'm in the English department as the only performance studies person, And so just that sense of like, oh, maybe I'm attracted to singular figures because I've had all of these singular kinds of experiences. But it's interesting, Simon, because I think it's not the same as the work that you're doing, but it's a similar kinds of
yeah.
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 Wow, thank you.
Yeah.
So I guess it's up to me to wrap things up now. We're just coming towards 5:30. Thank you so much, Katie, for really beautiful readings and introduction to the whole project. I think you framed it in a really brilliant way for us to kind of access those extracts. And thank you everyone for joining from wherever you are, and for participating with questions, discussion. And now I'm going to think about the mystics that are leading me through through my life.
Good.
So thanks very much, everyone. I'll stop recording now.